Blood in the snow would change Reese Calder's entire life, though he didn't know it yet. Kneeling over the one Apache woman still breathing in the wreckage of an ambushed wagon, while the men who wanted her dead were already saddling up to finish the job. Winter, 1876, Arizona Territory. Reese was a lonely rancher who wanted nothing from this canyon country but silence, until the morning he rode down into a ravine full of dead guardians and pulled out the one thing that would unmake everything he thought he knew about being alone. A chief's daughter running from a marriage and a massacre both, with pursuers still coming behind her. Stay with us to the end, because what came hunting her by moonlight was worse than anything the winter itself could do. The wind that morning carried two smells Reese had learned to tell apart from a long way off: snow and blood. Snow was just weather. Blood out here was always somebody's ending. He'd been riding this stretch of Coldwater Canyon since before he could grow a proper beard, checking strays and mending line shack roofs, and bearing the odd steer that hadn't survived a bad winter. And in all those years, the canyon had never once smelled like this. He reined Boone up short at the rim, the bay gelding blowing steam and stamping, ears pinned flat toward the ravine floor, the way a good stock horse pinned them at a rattler coiled somewhere close. Reese sat still a long moment, one gloved hand resting easy near the colt on his hip, reading the canyon the way his father had taught him to read weather, not with his eyes first, but with his gut. Something in him wanted to turn around. He didn't. He walked Boone down the switchback trail into the ravine, and the wreckage came into view piece by piece, the way bad news always seemed to arrive on the frontier. First a splintered wheel wedged against a boulder, then a scatter of canvas torn to ribbons and snapping in the gale, then the wagon itself, driven or blown clean off the trail and shattered against the granite teeth at the canyon's base. Bodies lay where they'd fallen, 3 men, then a fourth, dusted over with a week's worth of drifting white that the mountain was already working to erase. Reese dismounted and moved from one to the next, checking for a pulse he already knew he wouldn't find, his jaw tight, his breath fogging in short controlled bursts. These hadn't been careless travelers caught by weather. The rifles scattered in the snow, the way 2 of the men had fallen facing outward instead of running, made plain these had been guards, and good ones, cut down defending something worth more than the wagon they'd been driving. He was turning back toward Boone, ready to leave the dead for whatever justice the spring thaw might bring, when a flash of color stopped him cold, a scrap of deep red and quillwork blue, impossibly bright against the gray rock and white snow, half buried beneath the wagon's broken axle. He crossed to it fast, boots punching through crust, and found not a bundle of trade goods but a woman, curled small in the lee of the wreck, as if she'd crawled there in the last minutes before the cold took her under. She wore a settler's plain wool dress, mud-stained and torn at the shoulder, but a beaded medicine pouch had slipped loose at her throat, and beneath a fold of ruined canvas, her fingers were still knotted around a leather bundle she hadn't let go of, even half frozen. Reese knelt, stripped his glove, pressed 2 fingers to the side of her throat. Ice-cold skin, and beneath it, faint and stubborn, a pulse. "Easy now." His voice came out rough, unused to speaking to anyone but a horse most mornings. "I've got you." It was a promise made mostly to the wind, because she gave no sign of hearing him at all. He didn't waste time on questions the dead men couldn't answer. He shrugged out of his own coat and wrapped her in it on top of the blanket. He kept rolled behind his saddle, gathered the leather bundle up with her rather than leave it for the wolves, and lifted her, terrifyingly light, her head lolling against his shoulder. black hair spilling loose and dark against the wool. He got her up onto Boone's saddle bow and mounted behind her, one arm locked around her ribs, and put his heels to the gelding's flanks. The sky to the west had already gone the bruised purple of a storm building fast, and Reese Calder's ranch was 6 hard miles of bad trail away. The ride back was its own kind of war. The temperature dropped with the light, the wind rising into a howl that found every gap in a man's collar and cuffs and turned it into a blade. Reese kept one arm clamped around the woman the whole way, feeling for the small shivers that would tell him her body was still fighting, and finding, with a cold dread that had nothing to do with the weather, that she wasn't shivering at all. He'd seen that stillness before, on a calf caught out in an early blizzard 2 winters back, and he knew what it meant. The cold had gone past hurting and into something worse. He leaned low over Boone's neck and pushed the horse for more than he had any right to, and the gelding gave it, driving hard through drifts already knee-deep, until the black shape of the cabin finally rose out of the whiteout ahead of them, tucked into its grove of lodgepole pine like something the mountain had decided to spare. He didn't stop to properly stable Boone, just stripped the tack and turned him into the lee of the barn with a promise of oats and grain later, and kicked the cabin door open with the woman still cradled against his chest. The one-room interior smelled of cold ash and dried sage, dark and still, and Reese crossed straight to the stone hearth and laid her down on the bearskin rug there, before he did anything else, before his own frozen hands, before his own aching back, and knelt to build the banked coals back into a real fire. The flames caught slow, then all at once, throwing orange light across rough log walls that hadn't held anyone's company but his own in 3 winters running. In that firelight, for the first time, he really looked at her. She was beautiful in a way that made the plain wool dress seem like a disguise rather than a garment. High cheekbones, a full mouth gone pale with cold, warm, sun-touched skin, now waxen and cold beneath his palm. Long black hair snarled with ice at the ends. A dark bruise spread along one temple, likely from the crash. Her feet, when he pulled off her ruined boots, were white and going waxy, dangerously close to frostbite, and he set to rubbing life back into them with the same brisk, unsentimental efficiency he used on a chilled, newborn calf, watching her slack face for any flicker of pain that would tell him feeling was returning. There was none yet. He filled his kettle and set it to heat, then took a cloth to the dirt and dried blood on her face, working with hands too big and too rough for the task, and found himself, for reasons he didn't examine too closely, being careful with her anyway. He sat up with her through that whole first night, feeding the fire until the small cabin turned sweltering, watching the rise and fall of her chest for any sign it might stop. The wind screamed at the shutters like something with a grudge. Somewhere past midnight, he noticed the leather bundle he'd carried in with her, and set it near the fire to dry rather than open it. Whatever it held, it wasn't his to look through. Near dawn, when the gray light was just beginning to bleed in at the window seams, a sharp intake of breath broke the quiet, and Reese looked up from the bridle leather he'd been mending out of habit and nerves both, to find her eyes open. They were dark and wide and utterly terrified, darting around the unfamiliar room like something newly caged, and she scrambled backward off the rug in one convulsive motion, pressing herself against the rough stone of the hearth with the blanket clutched to her chin. A stream of words spilled out of her, low and urgent, in a language Reese had heard traded men use at the fort, but never spoken directly at him, and he understood not one syllable of it and every ounce of its meaning anyway. He set the leather down slow and raised both hands, empty, palms out, the way he'd calm a spooked colt that had never had a reason to trust a man's hands before. Easy. He kept his voice low, level, the words themselves less important than the sound underneath them. You're safe here. Nobody's going to hurt you. She didn't understand the words. He could see that plainly in the blank, wary set of her face. But she understood the register of it, the same way any animal alive to danger reads a man's stillness before his speech. And her eyes went to the gun belt hanging on its peg by the door, then back to him, cataloging his size, his beard, the calluses on the hands he still held open in the firelight. She was shaking hard now, not from cold this time, but from something closer to pure animal alarm. Reese moved to the stove with slow, telegraph steps and ladled broth into a tin cup, the steam curling up warm and savory in the cold room, and set the cup down midway between them on the floorboards before retreating back to his own chair by the fire. Eat, he said, and mimed the motion of drinking, feeling faintly foolish and not caring. She watched him for a long, taut stretch of time, her chest heaving, calculating something behind those dark eyes. And then whatever animal need for warmth and food finally won out over the fear, and she crawled forward, the wool blanket sliding off one bare shoulder, and took the cup in both trembling hands. She drank in fast, greedy pulls, choking once, forcing herself to slow. When she finished, she set the cup down carefully and looked at him for a long moment. Thank you. The English words came slow and heavily accented, as if she'd learned them from listening at a trading post rather than living among people who use them daily. Reese felt something loosen in his own chest at the sound of them. He tapped 2 fingers to his own sternum. Reese? She studied him a moment, weighing the cost of a name the way a person weighs the cost of a debt, before she finally lowered her chin. Aiyana. The word came soft, and it sounded to Reese's ear like something out of a language built for better things than the hard, flat country outside his door. The storm screamed on past the shutters, sealing the 2 of them into that small shared room, 2 strangers from entirely different worlds, bound for now by nothing more than the plain fact that she was alive, and he had decided without quite meaning to, that she was going to stay that way. If stories like Aiyana and Reese's keep you watching, tap join beside the channel name to become a channel member and help this channel grow. The days that followed came slow, marked out by the shifting light on the floorboards and the shrinking woodpile by the door. For the first 2 full days, Aiyana barely left the hearth, sleeping in long stretches while her body worked to repair what the cold had nearly taken from her, and Reese kept to his usual chores around her, chopping wood, checking his trap lines along the frozen creek, seeing to Boone, though he found himself doing all of it with one ear turned back toward the cabin the entire time. The place began to change under him in small ways he only half noticed. He started closing the door soft instead of letting it bang shut behind him. He caught himself stamping snow off his boots on the porch instead of tracking it clear to the hearth, the way he'd done alone for 3 winters without a single thought for who might mind. They talked little in those first days, the language between them thick as the drifts outside, but necessity built its own bridges faster than either of them expected. He learned she'd rather have tea than the bitter black coffee he lived on, and dug out a tin of dried mint he'd been saving for no reason he could name, and brewed it for her without a second request. The small, startled smile she gave him over that first cup was the first real crack in the careful wall she'd built around herself, and Reese found he'd have chopped a season's worth of extra wood just to see it again. On the third afternoon, the fever that had been threatening her finally broke for good, and he came in from the barn to find her sitting up by the window, the leather bundle open in her lap for the first time. Inside it was a garment Reese had never seen the like of. Soft tan doeskin the color of dark honey, worked along the yoke and sleeves with quill work and trade beads and patterns that traced a story he had no way to read. Fringe at the hem gone stiff with dried mud and torn clean through at one shoulder seam. Aiyana held it in both hands, the way a person holds something that used to mean everything, and now looked in the flat winter light of a stranger's cabin, like something ruined beyond saving. She looked up and caught him watching, her face going tight with a distress that needed no translation, and mimed a sewing motion, pointing to the torn seam with a kind of desperate precision. Reese's own repair kit was built for canvas and harness leather, coarse wax thread and heavy needles meant for a man's rough hands, and he felt an odd embarrassment handing it over, watching her small fingers close around a needle that must have looked to her like a nail. But she didn't weep over the mismatch. She simply nodded, the same pragmatic acceptance he'd have expected from a rancher's wife facing a broken fence in a snowstorm, and sat by the window to catch the last of the fading light, working the coarse thread thinner between her teeth to make it behave. It was slow, punishing work. Reese oiled his rifle at the kitchen table and watched her out of the corner of his eye, and saw in the set of her jaw something he recognized in himself, the particular stubbornness of a person who refuses to let hard tools be the reason a thing worth saving stays broken. By the time the storm finally blew itself out days later, uncovering a world scoured to a blinding white, a fragile rhythm had settled over the cabin. The dress was mended, the black wax thread standing out along the tear like a scar against the honey-colored hide, and Aiyana wore it with a dignity that made the mismatch seem beside the point entirely. She refused to sit idle as her strength came back. She couldn't yet split wood or haul the heavy water buckets, but she took over the cabin's interior with a thoroughness Reese had never once managed himself, sweeping the packed earth floor, reorganizing his pantry tins into some order he didn't understand but knew better than to disturb. She was not, Reese came to understand, a woman who had ever been idle in her life, whatever her father's rank among their people. When her strength allowed it, she took to walking the tree line at the edge of the clearing each morning and came back with things Reese would never have thought to gather himself. Dried yarrow and willow bark she pressed on him the one time he came in favoring a strained shoulder, a poultice of crushed plantain leaf she packed against a rope burn on his palm that healed clean in half the time his own remedies ever managed. She showed him how to set a snare low along a rabbit run, using nothing but braided sinew and patience, crouched in the snow beside him with a focus that made him feel, for the first time in years, like the one being taught rather than the one doing the teaching. Once, clumsy with the unfamiliar words, he wondered aloud where she'd learned so much of the land that wasn't even her own territory. She'd looked at him with something like quiet amusement and let him know that hunger and healing looked much the same from any mountain, and that a woman raised to lead a band someday learned early that surviving the land came before anything else her father's title might promise her. One evening, whittling a new handle for his axe by the fire, Reese looked up to find her watching him, a bowl of stew warming in her hands, seasoned with dried herbs from his own stores he'd never once thought to use. The smell of it was richer than anything he'd cooked for himself in years. "You have strong hands," The words came easier now, and she pointed at the careful knife work. He looked down at his own hands, scarred and stained and thick-knuckled from a decade of fighting this land alone. "They were," was all he said, and took the bowl from her, and it was, without either of them naming it as such, the first thing that had ever passed easily between them. Reese was not a man given to talking about himself, but the winter had a way of loosening things a person kept locked down tight, and one night, staring into the fire long after Aiyana had gone quiet on the other side of the hearth, he told her, in short, plain sentences she mostly followed, about the wife and the infant son he'd buried on the rise behind the barn 3 winters back, taken inside of a week by a fever that hit half the valley and spared most everyone but them. He told her he'd stayed on the ranch afterward, not out of any love for the solitude, whatever he'd claimed to himself, but because leaving would have meant admitting the 2 graves on that rise were the only things still tying him to a life he no longer much wanted to live alone. Aiyana didn't offer him easy comfort for it. She simply reached across the small space between them and rested her hand over his, warm now, steady, and let the silence hold what neither of them had the words to finish. On a clear afternoon not long after, Reese took her up the rise behind the barn, past the corral, and through a stand of young aspen, to the 2 small markers he'd cut and set there himself 3 winters back. He didn't say much, standing over his wife's grave and the smaller one beside it. Just turned his hat over once in his hands the way he always did when the weight of it caught up to him unexpectedly. Aiyana didn't fill the silence with easy words she didn't have in either language. She simply knelt in the thin snow beside the markers, laid a single sprig of dried sage she'd carried up from the cabin across the smaller stone, and sat with him a long while without needing to explain the gesture, her shoulder pressed light against his. Grief, she told him quietly afterward, wore the same face in every language she'd ever learned, and a person only ever needed someone willing to sit inside it with them a while, instead of trying to talk them out the other side too fast. Reese didn't have an answer for that. He simply reached over and took her hand, and they walked back down to the cabin together as the light went gold and long across the snow. One evening, as Reese sat working a bridle by the lamp, he noticed her at the rough-hewn table with a stub of charcoal from the cold hearth, drawing on the back of an old supply ledger. Not a picture, but rows of careful marks, symbols he didn't recognize, worked with a steadiness that seemed to carry weight beyond the paper itself. "What is that?" he asked. Aiyana didn't look up right away. "A song," she said finally, her English coming faster now, sharpened by weeks of daily necessity. "From my people. It says the mountain does not bow to the wind." She looked up then, and the firelight caught something raw and old in her eyes. "My father is a chief among our band. He is called Aituha. He promised me to a war leader from another camp, twice my age, a man I never chose and never wanted, to buy a peace neither side truly wanted kept." Her hand tightened on the charcoal until it cracked in 2. "I would not be given away like a horse traded to settle a debt." The silence that followed sat heavy between them. Reese understood then, all at once, the true size of what he'd pulled out of that ravine. Not simply a woman lost from a wagon, but a chief's daughter, worth more to some men than gold, worth enough to some other men to kill for. "The wagon," he said, careful, testing the ground. "Those weren't just drivers." It wasn't a question. He'd seen the quality of the rifles scattered in that snow, the deliberate way the men had fallen defending rather than fleeing. Aiyana went very still, her gaze dropping to her folded hands. "No," she said quietly. "Guardians." My father sent them to bring me home, away from the marriage, to my mother's people north of the Salt River, where I would be safe until he could settle it himself. Her voice thinned. They died for me. The weight of that sentence filled the whole small room. The snow will cover the tracks a long while yet, Reese offered, the only comfort a man in his position had to give. Nobody's finding this place before the thaw. She looked to the door, then back to him, searching his face for the lie in it and finding none, and let out a long, shuddering breath. Until the thaw, she repeated, like a woman clinging to the only mercy the mountains had left her. What she didn't tell him that night, because she herself didn't yet know the whole of it, was the name of the man who wanted her dead rather than simply return. Silas Voss ran the trading post 2 valleys over and sold rifles and whiskey to whoever's coin was heaviest that season. And 3 years back, he had been the man who guided the raiders into her father's summer camp for a price. The raid that had first scattered her people and left old wounds that had never fully closed. If Ito's daughter walked free and told what she knew of who had drawn the map that let killers into a peaceful camp, the story Voss had spent 3 years building, that raiders from a rival band had done it, that the whites bore no blame at all, would come apart in a single season, and the trading rights and the land deal he'd built on top of that lie would go with it. A dead woman lost to weather told no such stories. A living one, found and protected and believed, could end him. Weeks folded into a month, the days bleeding together in the slow hypnotic rhythm the high country imposed on anyone snowed in past its mercy. The cabin, once a place Reese had guarded fiercely against company of any kind, had become something closer to a shared vessel, the two of them navigating the frontier's wide, indifferent ocean together. Aiyana's strength returned not in a rush, but the way frost creeps slow across a window pane, and she began venturing outside wrapped in one of Reese's spare coats, which swallowed her small frame whole, watching him work the horses and mend fence with an intensity that made the hair on his arms stand up under his own coat. She took to teaching him words from her own language in trade for the English ones he gave her without meaning to, pointing at the fire, the snow, his hands, and repeating the Apache words slow and patient, until his clumsy tongue got it close enough to satisfy her. In turn, he showed her how to read the sky for a coming storm the way his father had taught him, and found more than once that she was already reading it better than he was, from a tradition entirely her own that had nothing to do with anything he'd learned from a white father on this same land. Neither of them corrected the other's way of seeing the mountain. They simply let both ways sit side by side, the way 2 languages can occupy one small cabin without either needing to win. There came an evening when the wind had finally gone gentle for the first time in weeks, and the two of them sat close by the banked fire, her hand resting easy in his without either of them remembering quite how it had gotten there. "I did not wish to be conquered," she said again, quieter this time, not explaining herself so much as testing whether the words still held their old sting when spoken to a man who'd never once tried to claim her. Reese turned her hand over in his, tracing the calluses along her palm that hadn't been there a month ago from all the work she'd taken on. "You aren't property," he said, low and hard as iron, the truest thing he knew how to say. "Not here, not to me." Aiyana didn't pull her hand away. She laced her fingers through his instead, slow and deliberate, a quiet pact sealed in nothing more than firelight, and the sound of the wind finally letting the mountain rest. "If you want more frontier love stories like this one, tap join beside the channel name to become a channel member." Long before any rider ever showed himself at the tree line, Aiyana had already started preparing the two of them for the day one might. She strung a line of deer hoof rattles low along the fence posts nearest the trees, the way her father's own perimeter guards had once ringed a summer camp against raiders, so that no horse could cross that ground quiet after dark. She taught Reese to read the particular way Boone's ears and nostrils worked when a stranger approached rather than a familiar animal, a skill sharper than anything he'd picked up in a decade of ranching alone. She walked the cabin sight lines with him more than once, naming where a man could get close under cover and where he couldn't, until Reese found himself looking at his own home the way a soldier looks at ground he intends to hold. It wasn't fear driving her, though the fear was there too, plain in the careful way she checked the door bolt each night. It was the plain, practical knowledge of a woman who had grown up understanding that safety was a thing you built with your own hands, not a thing you waited on someone else to provide for you. The false spring arrived with a treacherous kind of beauty, sun melting the surface of the drifts by midday, only for the water to freeze again into hard sheets of ice each night. And it was on one of those bright, deceptive afternoons that the isolation finally broke. Reese was at the corral breaking ice in Boone's trough, when the gelding's ears pinned flat and a low warning snort rolled out of him. Reese froze, his hand dropping to the colt on instinct, and scanned the tree line until a rider separated slow out of the shadow of the pines, a black horse stepping high and careful, a man in the saddle who sat like someone more used to city streets than open range. He didn't look back toward the cabin, trusting that Aiyana had already seen the rider from the window and would keep to the plan they'd quietly worked out in the weeks since he'd told her Voss's name. He walked instead to the gate and leaned against the post with a casualness that cost him more than it looked. The rider stopped 10 yards out, a handsome man in a smooth, careful way that put Reese in mind of a snake sunning itself on a warm rock. "Afternoon," the stranger said, easy, carrying the drawl of somewhere south and moneyed. "You're a hard man to find out here." Reese didn't smile. "I'm not lost." The man chuckled, dry as leaves skittering across stone. "No, I don't suppose you are. But something else is." He leaned forward over the saddle horn, looking for a wagon and its passenger, a young woman. Might have been dressed finer than the country called for. Reese held the man's gaze with the flat, bored indifference of a rancher who'd rather be doing anything else. "Found a wagon in the ravine 2 weeks back, smashed to kindling. Wolves had already been at the bodies by the time I got there." He let the lie sit easy in his mouth, blending it close enough to truth to hold. "Didn't see any woman." Voss's smile didn't move, but something behind his pale eyes hardened, and his gaze drifted past Reese's shoulder toward the thin curl of wood smoke rising from the cabin chimney. "Wolves," he repeated soft, "thorough creatures, though they usually leave the bones scattered where a man can find them." He gathered his reins. "Name's Voss. I'll be camped down along the creek a few days. There's a substantial reward for anyone who remembers something useful. Gold enough to buy this whole mountain twice." Reese watched him right away and knew, with the same certainty he'd have felt watching a storm build over the western ridge, that the man hadn't believed a word of the lie and wasn't finished with this valley yet. He bolted the cabin door hard behind him when he went back in, and found Aiyana standing in the shadow of the kitchen corner with a paring knife gripped white-knuckled in one hand. "He knows," Reese said, stripping off his coat and crossing straight to the gun rack for the Winchester. He checked the magazine, the brass catching the low firelight. "He's camped by the creek. He'll wait for dark." Aiyana's fear hardened into something flinty and fierce as she watched him work. "I can go to him," she said, quiet, urgent. "If I walk out there myself, he leaves you be." The thought of her walking into that man's hands to spare him put a physical ache through Reese's chest, sharper than anything the winter had managed. No. He crossed to her and set both hands on her shoulders. We hold the door. Together. Night came down over the valley like a dropped hammer, snuffing out the last color from the sky. Reese doused the lantern and left only the dying coals to throw a dull red glow across the room, then took his post by the shuttered window. The Winchester braced on the sill, the shutter cracked open a bare inch. Aiyana settled beneath the sill out of the direct line of fire, her breathing shallow and controlled, the paring knife still in her hand. Hours crawled by. The wind picked up outside, masking whatever footsteps might already be crossing the yard toward them. Then glass shattered at the bedroom window, not from a bullet but from a firebrand, a kerosene-soaked rag wrapped around a stone, landing hard on the quilt and catching fast, flames licking hungrily up the dry wool. Reese spun toward it, shouting for Aiyana to stay low, but she was already moving, dragging the heavy bare rug off the floor and throwing it over the fire, stamping it out with a desperate, furious energy that had it smothered inside seconds. In the same breath, the front door shuddered under a massive blow. Voss wasn't waiting on the dark anymore. Reese fired straight through the door planking without hesitation, the Winchester's report deafening in the small room, and a shout of pain answered from outside, followed fast by two return shots that splintered the door frame and sent wood chips raining across the floor. "Watch the back," he called, racking the lever hard, certain a man like Voss never rode without a second gun somewhere close. But the back stayed quiet, and a heartbeat later the front door burst inward off its shattered lock, and Voss stood framed in the moonlight with a revolver in each hand, the polite mask finally gone from his face. He was fast. Reese was faster, or maybe just steadier, dropping to one knee and firing upward in the same motion, and the shot caught Voss square in the chest and threw him backward into the snow beyond the threshold. The silence that followed rang louder than the gunfire had, and Reese stood slow, rifle still trained on the empty doorway, and stepped out into the cold to be certain. Voss lay on his back, breath bubbling wet and shallow, the surprise on his face more honest than anything he'd said all afternoon. He died without another word, the dark simply taking him the way it takes most men who spend their lives certain it never will. Reese stood over the body a long moment, feeling the adrenaline drain out of him into something colder and heavier, and then felt a hand close on his arm. Aiyana was there, shivering hard in the night air, looking down at the dead man without flinching from it and without any pretense of grief either. She looked at the body, then at Reese, and gave a single steady nod, an acceptance of the violence it had taken to keep her safe, a seal set on whatever the two of them had already become to each other. They buried Voss the next morning in the hard ground past the tree line, marking the spot with nothing more than a plain cairn of stones, a pragmatic necessity as much as anything, hiding the evidence of the night's fight from anyone who might come asking later. But it felt, too, like they were burying something else, the last of the fear that had hunted Aiyana clean across two territories. When they came back inside, the cabin air felt different, lighter, scrubbed clean of the dread that had been living in the corners of it for weeks. Aiyana went straight to the trunk where she'd folded her mended dress away, and this time she didn't hide it at the bottom, beneath the plain wool of her disguise. She lifted it out, ran her thumb once along the black threaded scar of the mended seam, and pulled it on over her head, letting the honey-colored doeskin and its quill work settle around her the way a person settles back into their own name after a long while going by someone else's. Spring reached the valley in earnest a few weeks later, the whole country breaking open in green almost overnight, the creek roaring with snowmelt, and the air gone thick with the smell of wet earth and pine sap. It was on one of those bright mornings, while Reese and Aiyana were out repairing the lower fence line, that the sound of many horses reached them from the ridge above, and Reese's hand went once more to the colt before Aiyana caught his wrist and shook her head, her eyes already fixed on the riders coming down off the high trail. "My father," she said, and there was no fear in it this time, only something closer to disbelief. Chief Ituha rode at the head of a dozen warriors, older than Reese had pictured, gray threading through dark hair, a face carved deep by grief that hadn't found its answer until this exact morning. He dismounted without a word and crossed the yard, and for a long moment, father and daughter simply stood holding each other while the men behind him watched in respectful silence. And Reese stood back by the fence with the Winchester left leaning untouched against the rail, understanding this moment belonged to no one but the two of them. When Ituha finally released his daughter, he turned his attention on Reese with the sharp, assessing look of a man weighing whether a debt was owed or a threat was standing in front of him. Aiyana told him everything, standing between the two men in a language that shifted back and forth between her father's tongue and Reese's. The massacre and the wagon and the winter of hiding, the name Voss and the raid 3 years gone that he'd engineered against her father's own camp, and the fight in the cabin doorway that had finally ended it. Itha listened without once interrupting, his face unreadable until the very end. And then he crossed the yard to where Reese stood and set one hand on his shoulder, a gesture that needed no translation at all. "You kept my daughter's life," he said, in English learned slow and careful over long years of dealing with men on both sides of every treaty line, when other men would have sold it. "I do not forget such a debt." The warriors behind Ituha had gone quiet and watchful through the whole exchange, several of them clearly kin to the men Reese had found dead in the ravine that first morning, and he understood, without needing it, explain that they had ridden through a hard winter of their own, searching, grieving, not knowing whether the daughter of their chief was alive or one more body lost to the mountains. One of the older men finally stepped forward and studied Reese a long moment, then looked to the mended doeskin dress Aiyana still wore, and said something low to Ituha that made the old chief's face soften further. Aiyana explained later that the man had served her guardians' families for 2 generations, and that seeing her standing whole in her own dress again, rather than buried in a nameless grave, was the only accounting he'd needed. Reese, who had spent 3 winters convinced he wanted nothing more from this life than silence and an empty cabin, found himself standing in his own yard with a dead man's blood still barely scrubbed from his floorboards and a chief's daughter's hand, finding its way into his without either of them planning it, and understood there was a decision still waiting to be made, and that it wasn't only his to make. Ituha had come to bring his daughter home, to the marriage he'd meant to shield her from all along, by sending her north, to a life among her own people that was rightfully hers to claim again. Aiyana stood between 2 worlds in that yard, the fence she and Reese had spent the morning mending still half finished behind her, and everyone present understood the weight of what she was about to choose. She turned first to her father and spoke to him gently in their shared tongue, words Reese couldn't follow, but whose meaning he read plainly enough in the old man's face. A slow softening, then something closer to reluctant pride than disappointment. When she turned back to Reese, her chin was lifted the same steady way it had been the night she'd first told him her name. "My father says the marriage they arranged for me is already broken. she said, loud enough now for Reese and every warrior behind a tuha to hear plainly. He says a daughter who survived what I survived owes no one a debt paid in her own life. She stepped closer, closing the last of the distance between them. I am going home to see my mother and to stand before my people as myself again. But I am not leaving this valley behind me forever, Reese Calder. I am asking you to come with me first, and then to build a life here that belongs to both our worlds, not just one of them. Idha watched his daughter say this with the same unreadable face he'd worn through the whole telling of her story, and then, to the visible relief of every warrior at his back, he laughed once, low and rough, the sound of a man who had given up on winning an argument with his own daughter years ago. She was always going to choose her own path, he told Reese, not unkindly. It is a family trait. Ask her mother sometime how she chose me. He extended his hand, and Reese, who had buried a wife and a son on the rise behind his barn, and never once believed he'd have reason to reach for anyone again, took it. Before we finish, tap join beside the channel name to become a channel member. It helps this channel keep making more stories like this one. Reese rode north with Aiyana and her father's men through country greening fast under the spring sun, and stood at the edge of a summer camp alive with the sound of children and dogs and cook fires, watching Aiyana move through a crowd of people who wept and laughed and pressed their hands to her face, like she'd come back from the dead, because in every way that mattered, she had. Her mother held her longest of all, and then turned that same fierce, searching look on Reese that Ituha had first given him in the yard, and seemed, after a long moment, to find whatever answer she was looking for, because she reached out and took his hand between both of hers and said something in her own language that needed no translating at all. Reese felt every eye in that camp on him the first evening, a lone white rancher standing at the edge of a world he had no claim to, and he half expected to be asked to keep his distance and let Aiyana's homecoming belong entirely to her people. Instead, it was Ituha himself who waved him forward to sit near the central fire that night, and told the gathered camp, plainly enough, that even Reese's poor grasp of the language caught the shape of it, the story of the ravine, and the winter cabin, and the man who had chosen to hold a door against Silas Voss, rather than hand a frightened stranger over for a reward. An old woman Reese never learned the name of pressed a bowl of stew into his hands without a word. The same unceremonious kindness Aiyana had shown him with tea on that first terrified morning, and something in Reese eased that he hadn't realized was still braced tight in his chest. He stayed among her people through that summer, learning the shape of a life he'd never once imagined for himself, watching Aiyana step back into a world that had grieved her as lost and now welcomed her home as something closer to a legend. The chief's daughter who had survived a massacre meant to erase her, who had spoken the truth that finally closed the wound Silas Voss had opened in her father's camp 3 years before, who had chosen, in the end, to build something new rather than simply return to something old. When the summer camp broke for the season's move, Aiyana and Reese rode south together, back toward the cabin in the pines in the valley they had first survived a winter in together, carrying with them her mother's blessing and her father's word that the trail between his camp and Reese's ranch would always stand open to both of them. They rebuilt the fence line that had been left half-finished in the yard the morning Idaha's riders came down off the ridge, working it the way they'd worked everything since that first frozen night, side by side, without needing many words for it, her hands steady with wire and leather, his steady with cedar rail, a boundary raised not to keep anything out but to mark, plainly, the shape of a home two people had chosen to build out of a tragedy neither of them had asked for. Aiyana hung her mended dress on a peg by the door where any visitor could see it plainly. No longer a secret folded away at the bottom of a trunk, but a plain fact of who she was, honey-colored doeskin and quillwork, and a black threaded scar all worn openly in a rancher's cabin that had somehow, without either of them planning it, become both their people's home at once. The seasons turned over the valley the way they always had, except now there were two sets of hands to meet them. Aiyana rode north each fall to sit with her father's council, and each spring to help her mother gather the first green shoots along the Salt River. And Reese rode with her every time, learning enough of the trail and the tongue that the crossing between the two worlds stopped feeling like a crossing at all and started feeling like simply the shape of his life. Word traveled, as it always does in a country that size, of the rancher who'd held his door against a killer for a chief's daughter, and of the daughter who'd chosen to build something new out of the wreckage rather than simply return to what she'd nearly lost. And by the time the second winter came around, no one riding through Coldwater Canyon needed the story explained to them twice. On a warm evening, deep into that first full spring, the two of them sat together on the flat rock above the valley, where they'd first spoken honestly of what each had lost, watching a hawk circle slow over land that belonged now to both of their worlds and neither one alone. Reese had pulled a chief's daughter half frozen from a massacre meant to silence her forever, never guessing on that cold morning in the canyon that the woman he carried home would be the one to finally teach him how to want a life again. Aiyana had come to this rough mountain valley, running from a marriage that would have cost her everything, and found instead a man willing to hold a door against the whole world for her sake, and a home built plainly enough that neither of their people ever needed to choose between them. The wind that came down off the ridge that evening carried nothing of blood or storm anymore, only the green smell of a valley waking up, and the quiet enduring promise of two lives that had chosen, deliberately and together, to be woven into one.